Hello, good listeners. Welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we talk about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to speak with Andrew Unger. Andrew is the creative mind behind the satirical and mostly Mennonite news site, the Unger Review. He's also the award-winning author of the book Once Removed, and he daylights as a high school English teacher. Here's part one of our conversation. Welcome to Tales, Andrew. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a pressing question. The most worn key on my laptop is the delete key. What's the most worn key on your computer?
I don't know why this is, but it's the A and the L.
Not the E.
Not the E. You know, I thought it would be the M, the E, and the N, you know, because I'm probably spelling the word Mennonite more than any other word. But for some reason, it's the A and the L, and I noticed they're the farthest apart on that one row. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just a faulty keyboard. I don't know.
Okay, glad to get that out of the way. As a youngster, what made you laugh?
I liked, they're probably the typical Saturday morning cartoons, things like that. But at an early age, probably earlier than most kids, I would say, I developed an interest in political cartoons. So I would, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, I bought those collections of, in those days, I don't know if they still do, they put out collections of the best Canadian political cartoons of the year. And I bought those. And so that was probably unusual for my age to be reading and have an interest in that. And then I actually drew political cartoons especially during the Mulrooney era. So I was, quite young. I drew political cartoons, filled up Hilroy notebooks full of those cartoons. As a teenager, I liked, of course, The Simpsons, which initially was kind of controversial. Now I think people have gotten used to it. David Letterman, that kind of stuff. That was more in the 90s.
Fast forward to present day, Andrew. What is it about satire that draws you in?
I think I've always had a little bit of a, facetious or a sarcastic sense of humor. And I like the fact that, it allows us the freedom to not take ourselves so seriously and to acknowledge that we all have flaws, we all have quirks, we all have foibles, myself included, So I think I've always, gravitated towards things that expose those aspects of life that, we're not perfect. We have flaws and inconsistencies, and I think that's what the purpose of satire is.
Are there historical figures, writers, or books that have influenced your thinking when it comes to humor and satire?
Definitely, Jonathan Swift, is a big influence. He's an Irish clergyman and author of books, for example, like Gulliver's Travels, but his most famous piece of satire is A Modest Proposal, which is quite dark, but he really critiqued the attitudes of the upper class of the time for their indifference towards the poor with this really biting satire. More recently, I've kind of got an interest in Erasmus, who is, I know, a theologian and biblical scholar, but also an influence on the Anabaptists and also a very well-known satirist. So there's even a little bit of a satire influence on early Anabaptism if you look for it.
The American writer Philip Roth described satire as moral rage transformed into comic art. How would you describe your satire?
I perceive it as gentle, lighthearted, maybe even teasing. So some of the times I feel like it's even friendly. Like it's poking fun, sure, but it's saying, here's this quirk we have, here's this foible we have, here's this tendency we have. That's how I would describe most of it. It's not always like that, right? But I think for the most part, it's to whatever degree satire can be respectful, it is. At least I perceive it that way. I'm not saying everyone else does.
So in a way, it's humble and points out humility by admitting our foibles.
Yeah, I know there's a quote by Katie Funk Weeb where she said that in her essay on why Mennonites, she felt, don't have a sense of humor. And she said that we should, because it actually is an act of humility. We should have more of a sense of humor or be more open to our sense of humor because it shows humility if you can laugh at yourself. If you can't laugh at yourself, that's a symbol of pride, not humility.
Did you just wake up one morning and decide the world needed a Mennonite satirical news site, or was it more strategic and simmering?
I didn't intend to start a satire site. I just wrote one article about the Steinbeck City Council, posted it on my own website. Like normally things that I had written, you know, who read them, things, non-satirical things that I'd written, 50 people, your friends. And then I woke up the next morning and thousands of people had read this article. And I'm like, what's going on here? So I thought, oh, there must be an appetite for this. So then it did sort of percolate and simmer for a while, for a couple months. And I, registered a domain name and made a website and stuff like that. And have been doing it ever since. So it was kind of a web, the initial idea was by accident. And then when I realized people liked it, that's where I kind of percolated about it and was more deliberate with it.
When you first launched the Daily Bonnet, now the Unger Review, you were careful to stay anonymous. Why was that, and why did you eventually decide to out yourself?
I had previously, actually even before I started the Daily Bonnet, I'd used a pen name, although it's not such a big reach. I had used my mother's maiden name as my last name and kept my first name. And that was always on the Daily Bonnet. That name was always on there. I mean, I honestly didn't know how people would react to it, because I'd seen how people react to the writings of Rudy Wiebe or Miriam Taves and other Mennonite fiction writers, and they haven't always received positive receptions from, certainly they've received positive receptions from some members of the Mennonite community, but not everyone. So I didn't know how people would react to it. Eventually, I guess, realized that people getting upset with things on the internet is just the nature of the internet. It's not even really a Mennonite thing to get upset about things on the internet. That's just the way the internet is. So I grew a thicker skin, I guess.
Satire can make people laugh and think and even fume, but it always needs a target. What widely held beliefs or values about Mennonites do you feel are worth exposing?
I actually share, and I am a Mennonite, and I share a lot of the Mennonite values and so on. It's not always to say that the values are wrong, but just to say that we're not always consistent in our application of those values, or maybe this value might contradict this other one, or we have a value that we claim to espouse and don't actually reach, don't always reach that. So I think that's more the focus of satire. Rather than to say you are wrong about something, it's just to say, are you actually reaching that? Are we actually reaching that? Are we actually achieving what we set out to do and what we claim to be doing?
It's the humorous angle on a preacher pointing out our hypocrisies on Sunday morning.
I don't really like to think of it like preaching. I don't really like to think of it as quite so didactic, like this is what you must think. It's like the preacher that would raise questions rather than say, this is what's wrong, Here's. Have you ever thought about this? That's the way I like to think of it. Now, people don't always perceive it that way. They might perceive it that I'm preaching at people, but I more feel like, don't think of it that way. I'm not even necessarily committed to everything I say on there either. Like sometimes I'm challenging myself and my own thoughts. So it's really just a matter of raising questions rather than saying, here's what replace what you're currently thinking with this other thought.
Underneath the exaggeration and the sarcasm and irony in stories at the Unger Review, I sense that you care perhaps deeply about how Mennonites are perceived and understood by a wider society. Am I misguided in thinking that?
No, I do care about that. It's kind of an interesting thing because in some sense people could say, well, I myself am shaping to some degree how people think about Mennonites and stuff like that. But very few people are reading or have read every article I've ever written, right? And if you do look at all of them or like a big chunk of them, you'll see that one article will come at it from this angle and one article will come at it from that angle. Some articles are more critical. Others are even praiseworthy. Some of them are critiquing Mennonites, yes, but some of them are critiquing the outside world from a Mennonite point of view. There's also that going on. I would hope that people would see that Mennonites are, let's say someone came to the website and knew nothing about Mennonites, which there definitely are people that do that. And it's shocking that because sometimes people think that I am presenting stereotypical views of Mennonites or whatever. But sometimes my articles actually are correcting people's stereotypes. Like I'll show something about, I don't know, a Mennonite church that has a worship band with guitars and drums and things like that. And some people who know nothing or know very little about Mennonites will say, well, Mennonites don't use electric guitars or drums, or Mennonites don't drive cars, or Mennonites don't go to public schools, or Mennonites don't dress in shorts and a t-shirt or whatever. They'll say things like this. And my articles are actually correcting those misconceptions. So I realize it's kind of a dicey situation, but I think it can, in isolation, fuel misconceptions, but it also corrects them as well.
But at the same time, I've also seen comments to your posts of people from other cultural or religious traditions, Lutherans or others, that say, oh, yeah, that's the same as in my community.
Right. Yeah, that can happen too. There's a lot of articles where I could replace the word Mennonite with the word Baptist or Lutheran or Catholic or whatever, and the joke would still work. You know, there was an article I did. Now this is more of a culture, Southern Manitoba culture thing rather than a Mennonite thing. But there's one about Mennonite woman that was using margarine containers, and this is called Mennonite Tupperware, right? We call these, margarine containers that you can buy sometimes at the MCC store, reusing those and so on. And a couple weeks later, Filipino-American comedian Joe Coy made a fake shopping channel video selling the same stuff as Filipino Tupperware. And so that joke, you could literally replace that word, Mennonite, Filipino, whatever you want to replace that word with, and it still works, So I think sometimes what I'm labeling as Mennonite, you're right, it could be anything else, or at least there's other options that could be plunked in there.
What are some memes and themes your satire draws from Mennonite religious and cultural history?
I do have a big interest in history, and there are times when and admittedly, these jokes are especially niche. So sometimes I'll refer to Conrad Grable or Menno Simons or Blaurock or whoever, and those jokes, it's a very small percentage, because even, sadly, even amongst Mennonites, we don't all know our history and early Anabaptism and stuff like that. People have a vague idea of who Menno Simons is, but your average person that doesn't really maybe necessarily have a big interest in history doesn't necessarily know all these figures from Mennonite history. Or I'll refer to things in terms of, Mennonites in Prussia or in Ukraine, connecting to my own family's history. Those jokes are probably the most niche because they don't necessarily play on a current stereotype that people are familiar with, that you have to have some knowledge that is maybe not right in front of your face.
On the flip side, a lot of people have learned the story of Dirk Willems on the frozen lake and helping the guy, his persecutor, out of the water.
Yeah. That image from the Martyr's Mirror has been spoofed, not just by me, but by many people, where you can take Dirk Willems and replace the drowning jailer with whoever or whatever is
the current flavor of the day.
Exactly.
For hypocrisy or for mockery.
Yeah.
That concludes part one of my conversation with Andrew Unger, novelist and the mind behind the Mennonite satire website, The Unger Review. Join me again next week for part two. To learn more about Andrew's writing, visit ungerreview.com. His books are part of the collections at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. To listen to this episode again, visit mharchives.ca. We welcome your questions and comments about this program. Just send us an email at info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace, and David Klippenstein, Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.